Hello there. This is a video about YouTuber Sargon of Akkad, and in particular, his video entitled Feminists for Autism. Now, I'm somewhat of a newcomer to this whole YouTube thing, and until very recently, I didn't have any clue who Sargon was. But a few people recommended I take a look at Sargon after I recently made videos about the amazing atheist and Thunder Surat, including someone on Twitter who asked for a shout out. So there you go, at Napsy743. So let's take a look at Sargon. Now, when I'm first looking at a new video, I find it helpful to ask a few simple questions about the argument the person is making in it and the means by which they do it. So, what's the ultimate point of Sargon's video? That's to make fun of feminists. By what means does he do that? Calling them autistic, which Sargon does at about 8 minutes into his video by running down a list of common signs of autism and applying them to what he thinks feminism is. Number 6. If you are socially challenged and have an inability to read facial expressions and body language, for example, if you can't tell when a consensual sexual encounter is being initiated without the explicit use of verbal cues, you might have autism. And he does that until the end of the video. And I'm in familiar territory here because I've seen a lot of this sort of thing before. All right, so we read basically 30 seconds into the video, and she's already proven to you, me, science, pretty much everybody, that she's a complete retard. Okay, all jokes aside, what the fuck is this bitch on any level whatsoever? So she's basically fucking insane? You crazy fucking mug. This bitch is just dumb, period. Like, they are actually fucking retarded. Because after all, that's all Sargon appears to be doing in his video really. The only difference here is the presentation. The point is still that feminists are dumb and bad, and you clever for not liking them. And you might be thinking, what about the first 8 minutes of Sargon's video? What does that contain? It could be a series of well-researched points supporting and leading up to his conclusion. Maybe this is what sets Sargon aside from being just another misogynist ranting about feminists on the internet. Or is it just a random assortment of unrelated arguments that only make sense if you stretch the meaning of the word feminism to an absurd degree? Well, gee, I wonder which it's gonna be. So, let's take a look. We're gonna go through Sargon's video up to his "feminists are all autistic" bit and look at each of his points in turn. But first, just a brief note about his intro. Now, the first 15 seconds of Sargon's video is unintentionally rather funny. Let's take a watch. First off, I love the little title sequence in the desert thing. It's like playing a game of Civ or something. I'm watching the History Channel, you know. What am I gonna be learning about today? And then that established tone is immediately undercut by this juvenile silliness. First question, who is this person? Sargon uses this image here and also made it the thumbnail of the video, so it's natural to assume this person features in the video, or is at least representative of something that Sargon is talking about. But aside from the thumbnail and the introduction, this person never features again. So what's going on? Now, if we Google for this image, we see it posted in a mocking fashion by the Feminist Twitter account Feminist Tweet, which posts a lot of lovely content, like laughing at a man calling a woman a cunt, urging people to drink bleach, and worst of all, posting clips from Family Guy. And, funnily enough, calling feminists autistic. And Sargon follows this account, so I'm just gonna assume that this, or somewhere like this, is where he got the image from. I'd wager neither Sargon nor his viewers actually know who this person is. I know who this person is because I went and checked. And I read back through a lot of their social media posts and never once saw anything directly relevant to anything that Sargon talks about in his video. So, my conclusion here is that this person has nothing at all to do with Sargon's arguments. They only here because they were being used as the face for that day's anti-feminist to minute hate. So, we only 15 seconds into the video, and we hardly off to a good start. But maybe it'll pick up when Sargon starts talking. Let's take a listen. But I will note here that Sargon presents his whole video sarcastically, which is quite helpful for us really, as it gives us an insight into what he thinks feminists think. If you're a feminist like me, you're probably aware that we live in a patriarchy. Now, for those who don't know, a patriarchy is a highly oppressive social system that benefits men at the expense of women. And this social system also oppresses men as well, by giving more money to women's health care. For example, women in London live up to 12 years longer than men. And that might sound like a good thing, but remember that's 12 more years of slavery that women have to endure. They are simply not allowed to do. It turns out that the patriarchy will spend almost £2 million more on women's health care than men's to ensure their suffering lasts well into their 80s. Of course, professional mras like Alan White, professor of men's health at Leeds University and lead author of the recent report on men's health, told the Bureau that there was a real lack of initiatives directed at the male population. Presumably because men's lives are so awesome, they simply don't need these initiatives. And as agreed at the last International Patriarchy meeting, that money would be better spent oppressing women. Ha ha ha. Now, I knew that Sargon put foot wrong here when he cited a university professor, but we'll come back to that in a moment. Let's take a look at his point. And it's easy enough to understand. Some areas of London spend more on health initiatives aimed at women than health initiatives aimed at men. The question here is, why is Sargon mentioning this? What does he think this challenges or contradicts? Well, he leads into the point by talking about patriarchy as defined by feminist theory, so we'll assume that he thinks this challenges that idea. And this is something you tend to see from a lot of anti-feminists. When talking about gender equality, many male anti-feminists in particular tend to focus on topics where men seem to be disadvantaged. For example, in custody, education, or, in particular here, healthcare. Their idea of a patriarchal society is one which favors men absolutely in every circumstance. So to challenge that idea, they start citing exceptions to the rule. And it would be a perfect argumentative strategy if that definition of patriarchy was the same one that feminists use. But it's not. Mainstream feminist thought sees patriarchy as oppressive to both men and women, which is something you'd think Sargon would understand since he said it, albeit sarcastically. Addressing men's involvement in gender equality by only stressing men's disadvantages leads to very simplistic and misleading assumptions. And that's not me talking there. That's Professor Alan White, who in a study called The Role of Men in Gender Equality says, involving men in gender mainstreaming and gender equality strategies bears the risk that gender is framed within certain terms in traditional sex role theory, mainly reflecting topics where men seem to be disadvantaged, for example custody, education, or health, opening up anti-feminist discussion. Addressing men's involvement in gender equality by only stressing men's disadvantages will lead to very simplistic and misleading assumptions. Therefore, one important preconception guiding the study to link pro-feminist, progressive, and critical men's policies and studies to gender equality policy while rejecting a male discrimination perspective pursued, for example, by men's rights groups and those theories linked to this approach. So, Sargon, Two helpful hints from me to you. Firstly, when you redoing your anti-feminist bit, do not cite university professors, especially ones who specialize in gender studies, because they are nearly always pro-feminist. Secondly, in particular, do not cite university professors who have published material that gives your exact anti-feminist argumentative strategy a swift kick in the buttocks. And before we move on, let's just briefly take a look at this Health Initiatives report that Sargon is quoting from. He presents it as though the reason certain areas of London have a large disparity in life expectancy between the sexes is solely down to the amount of money spent on health initiatives. But this is actually contradicted by the report. When Sargon quotes, "Women in London live up to 12 years longer than men," he's talking about an area of London called Cathedrals in Southwark, which is the ward which has the largest disparity, which is 12 years. However, as the report points out, Southwark spends nearly £5 million more on men's health initiatives than women's. They have the largest disparity in life expectancy, despite spending nearly 3 times as much on men's health than on women's health. Now, what that says to me is that the health initiative funding is reactive, not the direct cause. They re-spending more on men in that area because men have worse health in that area. And the report does go into some reasons that men have lower life expectancies in the more deprived areas of London. The economic climate, depression, suicide, a low level of council funding for health in general, social stigma against men showing vulnerability and asking for help. And that last point is a perfect illustration of the feminist understanding of how patriarchy is harmful to both men and women. And this point comes up again when Sargon brings up the disparities in the homeless rate and the suicide rate. Just because 3 out of 4 homeless people and suicide victims are men, that doesn't mean we need to talk about this. I mean, have you considered that 1 in 4 homeless people and 1 in 4 suicide victims are important? No, I didn't think you did you, Mr. Entitled? What a misogynist you are. So let's take a brief look at the sources Sargon took these headlines from. The homelessness headline comes from an opinion piece in the Telegraph complaining about a press association article published in The Guardian, which itself was about a homelessness audit carried out by the charity Homelessness. Peel that onion. Now the POW article chose to focus on the audit's findings that homeless women are more likely than homeless men to use drugs like heroin and cocaine, and more likely to suffer from mental health issues, which, according to the Telegraph opinion piece author Glenn Poole, was the pro-feminist Guardian being lazy, biased, and sexist against men. Now, whatever we think of that, in the course of writing his piece, Glenn Poole contacted Homelessness and got a response offering one explanation for why the majority of homeless people who don't receive support are male. And the Homelessness spokesperson said, homeless men are more likely than women to say they don't need support. Now the suicide headline is taken from a Guardian article, and that's the same Guardian who were dishonest, pro-feminist shills about 15 seconds ago, but here are being presented as a legitimate news source. The Guardian article is about the disparity in the suicide rate between sexes in government statistics, and it also talks about the launch of an investigation into the causes of suicide by the University of Bristol and the charity Samaritans. And they quote the head of policy and research at Samaritans on the reasons they believe men tend to be higher risk of suicide than women. In particular here, talking about working-class men. They will grow up expecting by the time they reach midlife they'll have a wife who will look after them and a job for life in a male industry. In reality, they may find that they reach middle age in a very different position. Society has this masculine ideal that people are expecting to live up to. Lots of that has to do with being a breadwinner. When men don't live up to that, can be quite devastating for them. And the Guardian article goes on to say, additional factors were the perception that it was more acceptable for men to turn to drink or other risky behavior to cope with difficulty, and men being often reticent about talking about their feelings. Sargon, the issues you pointing out that you think contradict feminist arguments are themselves feminist issues. Feminists don't deny the fact that men are more likely to commit suicide or be homeless. You know, they are not delusional. They believe that one of the factors contributing to those disparities is a difference in societal expectations of the genders. In particular here, it's seen as less acceptable or appropriate for men to seek help when they need it. This fixed notion of gender roles is one of the things that feminists generally want to see changed. So then, let's somewhat reluctantly move on to autism. Because the problem is that we really don't understand autism in girls. And that's a problem. For example, when a large new study finds significant deviations in brain structure and behavior between boys and girls with autism, you can tell that they are in fact total misogynist pricks who are deeply anti-feminist and, of course, by definition, anti-woman. Drvinat Menon, a professor of misogyny and oppression at the Stanford School of Medicine and one of the study's authors, told the Huffington Post that girls with autism display autism symptoms differently, and this may lead them to be underdiagnosed or may make it harder for them to get the most appropriate treatment. As if his single study overturns 30 years of feminist scientific research establishing that there are exactly zero differences between men and women on both a biological and social level. In this study, while the boys and girls had similar WEC scores as well as comparable social behaviors and communication skills, the boys showed significantly more repetitive and restrictive behaviors than the girls did. Because traditional science, or science, is a patriarchal male social construct specifically designed to exclude women and ensure that men always score better in anything that they do. And it's this very same science that goes on to show that the analysis of the brain scans reveals that autistic boys have different brain patterns in regions associated with motor function and the planning of motor activities. What this is a patriarchal conspiracy. So at this point in the video, I started wondering who Sargon is actually arguing against. He's reading out a neutral-voiced news report about a scientific study from the science section of the Huffington Post and just inserting sarcastic jabs at feminism seemingly at random. And just personally, as a new viewer of Sargon's, I had no idea what he was talking about here. There's no actual mention of feminism in the article, and Sargon doesn't mention anyone who actually agrees with what he's sarcastically saying. Sargon, the article, who actually Maybe it's just me ignorance, but I have never seen a feminist ever argue that males and females with autism have identical biologies and brain patterns. You know, that school of feminist thought must have passed me by. I don't think I've ever even seen a feminist argue that there are zero social differences between the sexes. I thought feminism existed because of these social differences in an attempt to redress the imbalance. You know, who is the person who actually said the things that Sargon is sarcastically arguing against? Was it this person? Or how about this person? Now, I don't really know who this person is. It's Steve Shives. I only really include him here because Sargon took a pop at him earlier in the video. So I went and watched Steve Shives' video, and he doesn't say anything about autism. I say the Sani then they. However, reading the comments on Sargon's video made me realize what he was doing. Having no actual person to argue against, he's simply inviting his audience to invent one. Imagine a feminist scientist who's so stupid and irrational in their crusade for gender equality that they want more women to have autism just to be equal with men. Imagine how stupid that person is who he just invented. Or have he spoken too soon? I'm going to level with you and give you the absolute truth of the matter. Autism is a feminist issue. 1 out of every 68 children today in the United States receives a diagnosis of autism. And, of course, 1 out of 42 of them is male. And 100 of them have a Tumblr account. And many people think that autism is the fastest growing developmental disability in the US. And there's no cure for autism. So this piece that Sargon's quoting from is by Esther Nelson from the website Feminism and Religion. So is this person the real, irrational feminist scientist that Sargon appears to be arguing with? Well, let's take a look at her article. The first thing to note here is that it's speculative. Note the question mark in the title indicating it's intended as a question and not, as Sargon said, a statement of absolute truth. Now, nowhere in this article does Nelson talk about how autism manifests differently in boys and girls. Nor does she talk about the statistical disparity between the sexes except to mention it as a statement of fact. The rest of the article is about behaviors in possibly undiagnosed, high-functioning autistic adult males and patriarchal interpretations of those behaviors. I.e., she's coming at this from a totally different angle than Sargon. She's certainly not arguing for increased diagnosis of autism in women. So we can cross her off the list of possible suspects for whoever Sargon is arguing with. So this raises a question. Why is her article in Sargon's video? It doesn't seem particularly relevant beyond being generally about autism. A cynic would probably point out that if you Google feminist and autism, it's, one of the first links that comes up. So it being in there is probably more to do with convenience than relevance. However, this is where Sargon pulls his list of common signifiers of autism from. Let's watch him run down the list. And just a note of warning before he begins here, you might want to hold your sides lest they split. There are 8 major signs of autism that you can identify in your friends, your family, your colleague, your coworkers, perhaps even your business or your organization, or even a social movement you happen to identify with. The first is an extreme sensitivity to criticism. If you feel that a different opinion makes you want to block that person and everyone who has ever spoken to that person, possibly via use of a blockbot on social media, you might have autism. The second one is that you have rigid thinking. You think that things are either right or they are wrong, and there is no gray area between them. For example, you might say that you are either a feminist or you are a sexist. If you reduce everything to these binary criteria, you might have autism. Number 3 is that you are easily distressed when things aren't right. Meltdowns, loss of control often happen. For example, if you need safe spaces to be able to discuss anything that might slightly upset you, you might have autism. In fact, I think I'll spare you the pain and we'll just fast forward the rest of them, because he does this for a very long time and it's very tedious. So there we go. We have finally reached the point of the video calling feminists autistic. So what was all that other stuff that came before it? You know, all the misrepresented or misunderstood news stories and studies. None of that has anything to do with this, but it does serve a purpose for Sargon, and it's this. It's to trick his audience into thinking they're not watching this. So she's basically fucking insane, you crazy fucking mug. This bitch is just dumb. Period. Like, they are actually fucking retarded. Because they are watching that. And to close me video here, I'm just gonna briefly look at this list myself. I but before I do, please understand, would never consciously use autism as an insult to describe people who disagree with me. I think it's crass and childish and insulting to people who actually have autism. What I'm about to do is show how easily Sargon's stretched interpretations of these behavioral signifiers can be turned back on him. I'm not calling him autistic. Offensive and lazy, maybe, but not autistic. Extreme sensitivity to criticism. For example, if you are so afraid of criticism that you refuse to listen to arguments that criticize your beliefs because they read too long, you might be Sargon of Akkad. Endless talking about or bulldogging a subject, usually in a monotone. For example, if you find yourself endlessly talking in a monotone about how stupid feminists are, you might be Sargon of Akkad. Often highly intelligent, but actually, this one does count. Lack of empathy. For example, if you think it's okay to use a developmental disorder that real people actually struggle with as an insult for people you don't like, if you think it's okay to use a photograph of an unrelated person as a clickbait thumbnail on a video calling people autistic, if you defended Elliot Rodger, and yes, Sargon defended Elliot Rodger, I and no, it's not all men who act this way. But you know what? It's way too many. Which is ironic considering that before your stupid social justice feminine bullshit, it didn't happen on this scale. It's crazy. This is a disease of the modern age. You are responsible for perpetuating it by disenfranchising these poor guys who don't have any options left. When someone takes the option of absolute's insanely last resort, you have to wonder what kind of system is producing them. And I tell you what, Lacey, it is effing feminist system that's doing this. If you defended Elliot Rodger, well, you get the point. Now we know there's gonna be a few people who comment on this video saying, it was a joke. Sargon's just joking. It's a joke video. It's not meant to be taken seriously. It's all a joke. My response to that is, no, it's not.